So, we are finishing up our Uncommon Wisdom series today, and we finish with one of my favorite books of the Bible, Esther. Part of why I love this book so much is that my last pastor did a sermon series on the book of Esther and pointed out just how much like a daytime soap opera it is. There is a lot more to the book of Esther than just today's reading. There are banquets, a spurned wife, an orphan being made queen, banquets, assassination attempts, plotting, betrayal, banquets, hidden identities, turns of fortune, and banquets. In fact, if you aren't familiar with the book, today's reading may not make that much sense to you, since this is the only week in the lectionary that it's covered. I won't be able to go in depth, but I do need to give you the Cliff Notes version so that you'll be able to understand what we saw in today's reading. It is a great book and not all that long, so I encourage you, if you haven't read it already, to do so. The book starts, the king of Persia, Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, and yes, that Xerxes from the movie 300, holding a 6-month banquet to show off his wealth and power. And what better way to end a 6-month banquet than with another banquet? There are going to be a lot of banquets, just as a heads up. At the banquet, Ahasuerus, still wanting to show off his wealth and power, orders his queen, Vashti, to leave the banquet that she is throwing for the women and come parade her in front of the men to show off her beauty. The queen, not wanting to just be objectified by a bunch of drunk men, understandably refuses. The king is none too happy about this and decrees that Vashti will never again enter his sight and will give her title to someone else. Enter Esther, stage right. Esther is an orphan whose Jewish name is Hadassah, but goes by the name of Esther in Persia. She is raised by her cousin, Mordecai, who adopted her. We are told that Esther is fair and beautiful, and all the beautiful virgins are being gathered up and taken to King Ahasuerus so he can pick a new queen. Mordecai advises her to keep her Jewish heritage secret, since there are those in the court that may do her harm if they found out about her ancestry. The king ends up picking Esther and holding another banquet to celebrate. If you're keeping count, we're up to 4 banquets now. Mordecai discovers an assassination plot against the king and warns Esther, who warns the king on behalf of Mordecai. The plot was thwarted, the would-be assassins executed, and Mordecai's role is written down in the book of the Annals. Now we get to meet the real villain of the story, Haman. 5 years have passed, and the king gives a big promotion to Haman, an Agagite. There's a long history between the Jews and the Agagites. To sum it up, they're hereditary enemies that really didn't like each other. Everyone is bowing and scraping before Haman with his new promotion, except for Mordecai, who refuses to bow to Haman. This enrages Haman, and he wants revenge. Getting back at Mordecai isn't enough, though. He plots to murder all of the Jews in the kingdom of Ahasuerus, and convinces the king to sign off on a decree saying that all the Jews on a prescribed date will be executed. Either Haman really has the king's ear, or the king doesn't seem to care too much about an entire race of people getting executed in his kingdom, since he never even asked Haman what people he was agreeing to sentence to death. And what better way to seal the decree than with a banquet? Mordecai finds out about the decree and goes to Esther to ask her to try to save the Jewish people. Esther originally doesn't want to approach the king about it, since unless she gets invited by him specifically, she can be put to death for going uninvited. Here we get to Mordecai's line that the title for today's sermon is from. Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. This is often one of the main focuses of the book, how God makes use of the situations we find ourselves in to achieve God's goals and purposes, or how God will put us in situations and events in our life to get us where God wants us, that we can do God's work. It's a powerful message and the common approach to this book. But remember, we're looking at uncommon wisdom. We're going to come back to this line, but in a slightly different context. Esther agrees and tries to help, and asks Mordecai to have all the Jews fast, and then she will go to the king. She knows that she can't go in all willy-nilly. She needs to be careful about how she does so. She gets herself ready, she puts on her royal robes, and goes before the king. She wins his favor, and he doesn't have her killed for the uninvited interruption. He asks her, "What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." Unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. The saying, "even to the half of my kingdom," really wasn't saying he would give her all that. It was really just a way of him saying that he was being generous and benevolent. She has a big ask to make the king, and since the king signed off on the decree, she needs to be careful how she goes about asking, because she doesn't want to insult the king. So instead of just coming out and asking there in front of all the court, she asks that the king and Haman come to a banquet that she's prepared. They do, and the king again asks Esther, "What is your petition?" Esther, instead of telling the king her real issue, then asks the king and Haman to join her tomorrow for another banquet that she's preparing for him. Told you there would be a lot of banquets. But there's wisdom to what Esther is doing. If she had asked the king when he was in front of all of his court, it would have possibly offended him, insulting him in front of everyone, and could have ended in disaster. By having a private banquet with just the two, she ensured that only the king and the man trying to murder all the Jews were present. Haman has the king's favor right now, though. Even though she's asked for the banquet, it would put the king in a position where he would need to choose between his most trusted official and his queen. So she tries to build up the request even more and ingratiate herself with the king at the same time. She knew that it wasn't the right time to act yet. After the banquet, Haman is on cloud nine. He's the king's favorite, and even the queen herself invited him to a private banquet. But then he sees Mordecai, who again refuses to bow, and he becomes livid. His family encourages him to build a gallows and to have Mordecai hung in the morning. That night, King Ahasuerus couldn't sleep, so he ordered someone to come in and read from the Book of Annals for him. I guess he was figuring that would help put him back to sleep. The portion that was read happened to be about how Mordecai had helped save the king's life. The king asks what reward had been given to Mordecai, and finds out that Mordecai never received anything. It's morning at this point, and just then Haman walks in. The king asks him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" The king doesn't say a name, just asks the question, and Haman arrogantly thinks that the king must be talking about Haman. So Haman says, "Let the man wear the king's robes and ride the king's horse and be paraded through the city." The king thinks that this is a perfect idea and tells Haman to go do so for Mordecai. So instead of getting to hang him on the gallows like he had hoped, Haman now has to instead reward him and proclaim him to the city. Haman is not happy, but then he gets taken to Esther's banquet. That's where today's scripture picks up. Esther knows to strike while the iron is hot. She acted wisely and waited for just the right moment, for such a time as this. All that wisdom that we have been talking about over the last several weeks, we see in Esther's actions. She has the king on the edge of his seat, wondering just what Esther has been building up to ask him. Mordecai was just publicly proclaimed and rewarded. Haman is disgruntled and upset. So at just the right time, she reveals her Jewish ancestry, and that Haman not only has plotted to kill the man that saved the king's life, but the queen as well. Haman's plan backfires. He ends up being hung on the same gallows that he had plotted to hang Mordecai. Mordecai is raised up to high standing with the king, and another banquet/feast ensues. Through some weird legal loopholes, the Jews are not only saved, but the people that would have killed them are instead killed themselves. Then, in another act of wisdom, Mordecai sees that it's the right time to use the power that's been given to him. He writes all throughout the land, proclaiming that all the Jews should celebrate. This proclamation ensures that the Jewish people don't forget just how close to destruction they came, and that they were rescued from that destruction. It also helps remind all those that would do the Jews harm what had befallen others who had attempted it. In addition, he helped make sure that the poor were being taken care of, by including gifts and presents that should be given to the poor. And so they celebrate with not one, but 2 festivals, and you guessed it, banquets. That brings the total up to 10. Like the Song of Solomon, this book never explicitly mentions God. The common approach is to see God in action behind the scenes. Esther just happening to be made queen. The king just happening to not be able to sleep and having the record read to him. The passage about Mordecai saving him just happening to be read. All of the coincidences that lined up perfectly to save the Jewish people. The more uncommon, but no less valid approach is to look at the wisdom and characteristics that Esther and Mordecai show. Their love for their family and for their people, how they use the power and position that they've been given to help those less fortunate than them, even seeing the poor taken care of as part of their festival, wisely choosing the right time to act instead of acting rash or foolishly inviting disaster. General George Washington had originally hoped to win a decisive victory over the British in one grand battle. At the Battle of Long Island, Washington was defeated and barely managed to escape. He realized that he would need to change his tactics. Instead of trying to defeat the British head-on in one grand battle, he switched to a more defensive tactic. He bided his time. Instead of a large battle, he would attack the Hessian outposts. Doing so didn't have much military consequence, but it did wonders for America's morale and dwindled away at the British morale. Washington never gave up on his hope for a decisive victory. He listened to wisdom and waited for the right time. That time came in the fall of 1781 with the Yorktown campaign. British General Cornwallis entrenched his army in Yorktown, expecting either reinforcements or evacuation. Coordinating with the French Navy under Admiral Francois Joseph Paul Comet de Grasse, hope I got that right, and Major General Lafayette, Washington began to cut off Cornwallis. Lafayette trapped Cornwallis in place, while de Grasse prevented the British Navy from resistance by keeping control of the Chesapeake Bay in the Battle of the Capes. Washington and the combined Franco-American army arrived and made Cornwallis's position indefensible. Cornwallis started surrender negotiations less than a week later. The surrender at Yorktown didn't end the war, but it did deal a massive blow with the surrender of over 7,000 British troops. It also gave Washington much-needed victory that greatly increased his political clout and reputation, which got him through the rest of the war and made him the logical choice for overseeing the Convention and becoming the first president. Like Esther and Mordecai, he waited and acted at the right time. He listened to Lady Wisdom and knew that to try a large strike too soon could allow his quarry to escape, or worse yet, could cost him defeat. When such time presented itself, though, he didn't falter. He struck when the iron was hot. Sometimes, as with Esther, we are purely put in the right place at the right time. But being in that place and time doesn't matter if it's not acted on. November of 23 until June of this year had been building up, positioning me for such a time. I've previously discussed how the job that I had been in prior was not rewarding. I wanted to get out, but I felt trapped because I felt like I needed to stay there so I could support and pay for my family. In November of 23, my wife found a better job that allowed a little more flexibility in my income and opened the door for me to look at other opportunities. 2023 had not been a great year for the company I was with, though, and they were wanting to cut some corners. Mid-January, they told me that I could either leave the company or take a good-sized pay cut. I didn't want to just jump ship without anything lined up, and my wife was making enough that we could afford it now, so I agreed to stay and take the pay cut. However, that boosted my motivation to try and find a more fulfilling job. It was then that I talked to my pastor, and shortly after met with the district superintendent, Mark, and got started down the path to vocational ministry. The district superintendent had asked about things like being able to go part-time or relocate. At the time, with where my wife was working, moving was limited to staying within about an hour of Longmont, as that was where her work was located. Then I waited, and waited, and waited. There were a lot of moving parts that I never saw that were involved, and I know that Mark was working very hard to try to work with me. In late May, Mark and I had a conversation again, wanting to see where things were at. At that point, little had changed with us, and he said that with the restrictions we had, he might not be able to find anything that would work this year. But they had another big meeting coming up, and that he would call back in about a week. I could have given up. I could have tried to find something else, but I felt that I should wait. Over those past few months, thinking and praying about becoming a pastor, I had found myself growing a deeper faith, a deeper connection with God. I didn't want to give up on that. I felt deep down that I shouldn't give up. Almost a week after I had talked to Mark, my wife got a new job that was full remote and had even better compensation. Not even 15 minutes later, Mark called concerned because it was looking like it wasn't going to work out this year. I told him that things had just changed and we could look at relocating now and that we had much more flexibility. He told me that he might be able to work out something then and would call me back. I'm not going to claim that it was divine intervention, just like it isn't explicitly said that God helped Esther where she was. But it seemed like everything fell together just right to put me in just the right place at just the right time. The next call that I got was in early June on a Saturday night while I was driving back from Pennsylvania from having visited my grandmother. After 11 hours of driving and at about 9 p.m. local time, I got a call from Mark asking about Torrington, and oh yeah, he needed to know by the end of the weekend. Given the circumstances, and that I wouldn't be able to talk to my wife about the position until I was back home on Sunday, he graciously gave me until Monday. This was the moment. It had all been for such a time as this. As you can guess, since I'm here standing in front of you, I chose to act, chose to seize the moment, to take that leap of faith. Things fell together astoundingly well to get me to that point at that time. But I needed to wait for the right time and then act when it came. If I had tried to act earlier, I might have found myself in a completely different occupation or may have ended up jobless. If I hadn't acted when I did, I may have still been at my old job or found myself instead at a different location instead of with this amazingly welcoming congregation and community. So as you leave here and go out into your lives, I would encourage you to pay special attention. Where do you find yourself that you have been placed there for such a time as that? Maybe it's a phone call to someone right when they need it most. Maybe it's a kind word to a server or a cashier that helps get them through the day. You don't need to save an entire people like Esther did. We can all be used to do God's work if we're wise enough to notice where we find ourselves placed to do good, and wise enough to act at such a time. Amen.